The Man Who Laughs by Victor Hugo. Preliminary Chapter. Ursus. Ursus and Homo were fast friends. Ursus was a man, Homo a wolf. Their dispositions tallied. It was the man who had christened the wolf. Probably he had also chosen his own name. Having found Ursus fit for himself, he had found Homo fit for the beast. Man and wolf turned their partnership to account at fairs, at village fetes, at corners of streets where passers-by throng, and out of the need which people seem to feel everywhere to listen to idle gossip and to buy quack medicine. The wolf, gentle and courteously subordinate, diverted the crowd. It is a pleasant thing to behold the tameness of animals. Our greatest delight is to see all the varieties of domestication parade before us. This is which collects so many folks on the road of royal processions. Ursus and Homer went from crossroad to crossroad, from the high street of Aberystwyth to the high street of Jedburgh, from countryside to countryside, from shire to shire, from town to town. One market exhausted, they went on to another. Ursus lived in a small van upon wheels, which Homo was civilized enough to draw by day and guard by night. On bad roads, up hills, and where there were too many ruts, or there was too much mud, the man buckled the trace round his neck and pulled fraternally, side by side with the wolf. They had thus grown old together. They encamped at haphazard on a common, in the glade of a wood, on the waste patch of grass where roads intersect, at the outskirts of villages, at the gates of towns, in marketplaces, in public walks, on the borders of parks, before the entrances of churches. When the cart drew up on a fair green, when the gossip ran up open-mouthed, and the curious made a circle round the pair, Ursus harangued and Homo approved. Homo, with a bull in his mouth, politely made a collection among the audience. They gained their livelihood. The wolf was lettered, likewise the man. The wolf had been trained by the man, or had trained himself unassisted to divers wolfish arts, which swelled the receipts. Above all things, do not degenerate into a man, his friend would say to him. Never did the wolf bite. The man did now and then. At least, to bite was the intent of Ursus. He was a misanthrope, and to utilize his misanthropy he had made himself a juggler. To live, also, for the stomach has to be consulted. Moreover, this juggler misanthrope, whether to add to the complexity of his being or to perfect it, was a doctor. To be a doctor is little. Ursus was a ventriloquist. You heard him speak without his moving his lips. He counterfeited, so as to deceive you, any one's accent or pronunciation. He imitated voices so exactly that you believed you heard the people themselves. All alone he simulated the murmur of a crowd, and this gave him a right to the title of Engastromythus, which he took. He reproduced all sorts of cries of birds, as of the thrush, the wren, the pipit lark, otherwise called the grey cheeper, and the ring also, all travellers like himself, so that at times, when the fancy struck him, he made you aware either of a public thoroughfare filled with the uproar of men, or a meadow loud with the voices of beasts. At one time stormy as a multitude, at another fresh and serene as the dawn. Such gifts, although rare, exist. In the last century, a man called Tozel, who imitated the mangled utterances of men and animals, and who counterfeited all the cries of beasts, was attached to the person of Buffon to serve as a menagerie. Ursus was sagacious, contradictory, odd, and inclined to the singular expositions which we term fables. He had the appearance of believing in them, and this impudence was a part of his humor. He read people's hands, opened books at random, and drew conclusions, told fortunes, taught that it is perilous to meet a black mare, still more perilous as you start for a journey to hear yourself accosted by one who knows not whither you are going. And he called himself a dealer in superstitions. He used to say, "There is one difference between me and the Archbishop of Canterbury. I avow what I am." Hence, it was that Archbishop, justly indignant, had him one day before him. But Ursus cleverly disarmed his grace by reciting a sermon he had composed upon Christmas Day, which the delighted Archbishop learnt by heart, and delivered from the pulpit as his own. In consideration thereof, the Archbishop pardoned Ursus. As a doctor, Ursus wrought cures by some means or other. He made use of aromatics. He was versed in simples. He made the most of the immense power which lies in a heap of neglected plants, such as the hazel, the catten, the white alder, the white bryony, the mealy tree, the traveler's joy, the buckthorn. He treated phthisis with the sundew. At opportune moments, he would use the leaves of the spurge, which plucked at the bottom are a purgative, and plucked at the top an emetic. He cured sore throat by means of the vegetable excrescence called Jew's ear. He knew the rush which cures the ox, and the mint which cures the horse. He was well acquainted with the beauties and virtues of the herb mandragora, which, as everyone knows, is of both sexes. He had many recipes. He cured burns with the salamander wool, of which, according to Pliny, Nero had a napkin. Ursus possessed a retort and a flask. He effected transmutations. He sold pancreas. It was said of him that he had once been for a short time in Bedlam. They had done him the honor to take him for a madman, but had set him free on discovering that he was only a poet. This story was probably not true. We have all to submit to some legend about us. The fact is, Ursus was a bit of a savant, a man of taste, and an old Latin poet. He was learned in two forms. He hippocrized and he pindarized. He could have vied in bombast with Rapin and Vida. He could have composed Jesuit tragedies in a style not less triumphant than that of Father Booze. It followed from his familiarity with the venerable rhythms and metres of the ancients that he had peculiar figures of speech and a whole family of classical metaphors. He would say of a mother followed by her two daughters, "There is a dactyl." Of a father preceded by his two sons, "There is an amphest." And of a little child walking between its grandmother and grandfather, "There is an amphimacer." So much knowledge could only end in starvation. The school of Salerno says, "Eat little and often." Ursus ate little and seldom, thus obeying one half of the precept and disobeying the other. But this was the fault of the public, who did not always flock to him, and who did not often buy. Ursus was wont to say, "The expectoration of a sentence is a relief. The wolf is comforted by its howl, the sheep by its wool, the forest by its finch, woman by her love, and the philosopher by his epiphanema." Ursus at a pitch composed comedies, which in recital he all but acted. This helped to sell the drugs. Among other works he had composed an heroic pastoral in honor of Sir Hugh Middleton, who in 1608 brought a river to London. The river was lying peacefully in Hertfordshire, 20 miles from London. He brought a brigade of 600 men, armed with shovels and pickaxes, set to breaking up the ground, scooping it out in one place, raising it in another, now 30 feet high, now 20 feet deep, made wooden aqueducts high in air, and at different points constructed 800 bridges of stone, bricks, and timber. One fine morning, the river entered London, which was short of water. Ursus transformed all these vulgar details into a fine eclogue between the Thames and the New River, in which the former invited the latter to come to him, and offered her his bed, saying, "I am too old to please women, but I am rich enough to pay them." An ingenious and gallant conceit to indicate how Sir Hugh Middleton had completed the work at his own expense. Ursus was great in soliloquy, of a disposition at once unsociable and talkative, desiring to see no one, yet wishing to converse with someone. He got out of the difficulty by talking to himself. Anyone who has lived a solitary life knows how deeply seated monologue is in one's nature. Speech imprisoned frets to find a vent. To harangue space is an outlet. To speak out loud when alone is as it were to have a dialogue with the divinity which is within. It was, as is well known, a custom of Socrates. He declaimed to himself. Luther did the same. Ursus took after those great men. He had the hermaphrodite faculty of being his own audience. He questioned himself, answered himself, praised himself, blamed himself. You heard him in the street soliloquizing in his van. The passers-by, who have their own way of appreciating clever people, used to say, "He is an idiot." As we have just observed, he abused himself at times, but there were times also when he rendered himself justice. One day, in one of these allocutions addressed to himself, he was heard to cry out, "I have studied vegetation in all its mysteries, in the stalk, in the bud, in the sepal, in the stamen, in the carpel, in the ovule, in the spore, in the theca, and in the apothecium. I have thoroughly sifted chromatics, osmosy, and chymosy, that is to say, the formation of colors, of smell, and of taste." There was something fastidious, doubtless, in the certificate which Ursus gave to Ursus, but let those who have not thoroughly sifted chromatics, osmosy, and chymosy cast the first stone at him. Fortunately, Ursus had never gone into the Low Countries, where they would certainly have weighed him. To ascertain whether he was of the normal weight, above or below which a man is a sorcerer. In Holland, this weight was sagely fixed by law. Nothing was simpler or more ingenious. It was a clear test. They put you in a scale, and the evidence was conclusive if you broke the equilibrium. Too heavy, you were hanged. Too light, you were burned. To this day, the scales in which sorcerers were weighed may be seen at Udewater, but they are now used for weighing cheeses. How religion has degenerated! Ursus would certainly have had a crow to pluck with those scales. In his travels, he kept away from Holland, and he did well. Indeed, we believe that he used never to leave the United Kingdom. However this may have been, he was very poor and morose, and having made the acquaintance of Homo in a wood, a taste for a wandering life had come over him. He had taken the wolf into partnership, and with him had gone forth on the highways, living in the open air, the great life of chance. He had a great deal of industry and of reserve, and great skill in everything connected with healing operations, restoring the sick to health, and in working wonders peculiar to himself. He was considered a clever mountebank and a good doctor. As may be imagined, he passed for a wizard as well. Not much indeed, only a little, for it was unwholesome in those days to be considered a friend of the devil. To tell the truth, Ursus, by his passion for pharmacy and his love of plants, laid himself open to suspicion, seeing that he often went to gather herbs in rough thickets where grew Lucifer's salads, and where, as has been proved by the Counsellor de l'Ancre, there is a risk of meeting in the evening mist a man who comes out of the earth, blind of the right eye, barefooted, without a cloak, and a sword by his side. But for the matter of that, Ursus, although eccentric in manner and disposition, was too good a fellow to invoke or disperse hail, to make faces appear, to kill a man with the torment of excessive dancing, to suggest dreams fair or foul and full of terror, and to cause the birth of cocks with 4 wings. He had no such mischievous tricks. He was incapable of certain abominations, such as, for instance, speaking German, Hebrew, or Greek, without having learned them, which is a sign of unpardonable wickedness, or of a natural infirmity proceeding from a morbid humor. If Ursus spoke Latin, it was because he knew it. He would never have allowed himself to speak Syriac, which he did not know. Besides, it is asserted that Syriac is the language spoken in the midnight meetings at which uncanny people worship the devil. In medicine, he justly preferred Galen to Cardan, Cardan, although a learned man, being but an earthworm to Galen. To sum up, Ursus was not one of those persons who lived in fear of the police. His van was long enough and wide enough to allow his lying down in it on a box containing his not very sumptuous apparel. He owned a lantern, several wigs, and some utensils suspended from nails, among which were musical instruments. He possessed, besides a bearskin with which he covered himself on days of grand performance. He called this putting on full dress. He used to say, "I have 2 skins. This is the real one," pointing to the bearskin. The little house on wheels belonged to himself and to the wolf. Besides his house, his retort, and his wolf, he had a flute and a violoncello on which he played prettily. He concocted his own elixirs. His wits yielded him enough to sup on sometimes. In the top of his van was a hole through which passed the pipe of a cast-iron stove, so close to his box as to torch the wood of it. The stove had 2 compartments. In one of them Ursus cooked his chemicals, and in the other his potatoes. At night the wolf slept under the van, amicably secured by a chain. Homo's hair was black, that of Ursus gray. Ursus was 50, unless indeed he was 60. He accepted his destiny to such an extent that, as we have just seen, he ate potatoes, the trash on which at that time they fed pigs and convicts. He ate them indignant, but resigned. He was not tall, he was long. He was bent and melancholy. The bowed frame of an old man is the settlement in the architecture of life. Nature had formed him for sadness. He found it difficult to smile, and he had never been able to weep, so that he was depraved of the consolation of tears, as well as of the palliative of joy. An old man is a thinking ruin, and such a ruin was Ursus. He had the loquacity of a charlatan, the leanness of a prophet, the irascibility of a charged mine. Such was Ursus. In his youth he had been a philosopher in the house of a lord. This was 180 years ago, when men were more like wolves than they are now. Not so very much, though.